Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all over our planet. I'm Joan Combs-Durso from Duke University. I am delighted to welcome you to the International Association for Feminist Economics Online Events Committee, second event in our methodology series on history in economics. Our moderator today is Shraddha Jain, and she is a research scholar at the Center for Development Studies in Kerala, India. Her research interests are women's paid and unpaid work, intra-household gender relations care, and the feminist political economy. We would ask you to post your questions in the chat. If you want to be added to our mailing list and you are not yet there, we will post the email for our IAFE staff member who will be happy to add you to our mailing list. Shraddha, it's yours.
Thank you, Joan, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this event, and it's my pleasure to introduce and having a conversation with two distinguished scholars of economics and history who have contributed so much to our understanding of women's life. Our speakers have done foundational scholarship on women's work, families, class, income, and migration. And there is a vast body of their work to learn from. We have Professor Jane Humphries, who is President of Economic History Association, Fellow of Cliometric Society, Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics, and Emeritus Professor of Economic History at University of Oxford. Her research has combined quantitative and qualitative economic analysis of periods ranging from 13th through 21st centuries. She has many publications, often co-authored with IFE members, and continues multiple research projects. She wrote and presented the BBC documentary, The Children Who Built Victorian Britain. Professor Samita Sen is Weir-Harmsworth Professor in Imperial and Naval History and a Fellow of Trinity College at University of Cambridge. She served as first Vice-Chancellor, Diamond Harbour Women's University. She was also Dean, Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies at Jadavpur University. She obtained her master's and degree in history at University of Calcutta and completed her PhD at University of Cambridge. Apart from doing very important work on history of women's labor, she has engaged in contemporary research on labor and feminist politics. Professor Sen has been active in many campaigns on women's equality. It's a great opportunity to learn and listen to these scholars with expansive work on British and South Asian societies and economies. We are sharing links to their work in the chat box. We requested our speakers to touch upon some of their work and reflect on some key questions such as how historical perspective can contribute to feminist and contemporary research, how economic analysis can be enhanced, and how history is important for our understanding of feminist political economy. We really want this session to be interactive and therefore would request the audience to ask questions and make comments after our speakers finish their talk. I first invite Professor Humphries to speak for about 15 minutes, and then I'll invite Professor Sen. After the first round of remarks, we will take up the questions from the audience and proceed through. I'll invite Professor Humphries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this event too. And it's wonderful to see so many people here. Some of my friends, indeed some of my co-authors are here on the Zoom call. I haven't prepared anything for this session because I want it to very much to be interactive. I want people to ask questions and stimulate discussion. I will begin then by just making a few points about historical work and feminist economics, economics of modern life. I'm very suspicious of lessons from history. It usually turns into a rather cheap history. But I think we can learn lessons in history. I think if we study historical topics, many of the questions that we have about women's position, status, role in modern society is illuminated. And I'll try and illustrate that with just a few comments from my own work. I also think that by studying, if we think that gender has any cultural traction, and of course, as feminist economists, we all do think that, then I think we must look at how we got to where we are, because that will illuminate the developments that have, in fact, branded us all culturally and molded our society. So I think that's another reason to try and look at the past and to view the past as an interesting lens on the present. Now, the problem is that very many, and I'm now going to be a little bit critical of my own discipline of economic history, because very many economic historians, particularly some doing gender analyses from a mainstream perspective, will simply look at what has become known as persistence studies. So they will find things like the adoption of the plow in pre-industrial times has persistent effects on the position of women in society by using econometric methods, regressing the adoption of the plow in its geographical distribution onto some indicator of women's position in modern society. And then this is presented as, a finding that with causation implied, very many of these persistence studies are deliberate attempts to try and use modern econometrics to demonstrate causality. You know the kind of thing if you go to economic history seminars, usually quasi-natural experiments, difference in difference, with IVs and a million robustness checks. The problem is that very often in these studies, the mechanisms remain very obscure. And I think that if we are feminist economists or interested in history, one of the things that we really have to work on is trying to understand the mechanisms that embed cultural traits in society, in individuals, in people. And that's really a very a much more difficult question than gathering, or actually many economic historians do not gather, they simply use existing data. But they use this data to demonstrate these kinds of correlations over time and space, and then present these as causal analyses. When I'm talking about trying to do historical work on gender, on women, on women's lives, women's economic roles, I immediately want to tell you this is very hard work because, of course, the sources are not sympathetic to our activities. Many of the sources, as in modern research, are constructed by men, and they're constructed by states, and they're for objectives. They have objectives that are far removed from uncovering the reality of women's lives. So, and I'm sure Samita is going to agree with this, we have to dig, and we have to dig and be creative as well. We have to use the sources that we come by in a creative way to try and understand women's positions in the past. Now, I've actually done quite a lot of work. I should say, let's illustrate this. Let's take the census, very often used by economic historians to look at female participation rates. But as Carmen Sarasua and I know very well, most modern censuses, not just the Great British Census, censuses of the mid-Victorian period, but censuses all around the world in the past, miscount women. They basically overlook women. They are not designed to pick up on the kinds of work that women did. They're looking really for occupational designations, whereas, of course, most women work in a way which leads an occupational descriptor. And this is, of course, true too in many poor countries. I know that many development economists, Lourdes Benarir, I remember her one time talking about some research she was doing where everywhere she looked, she could see women working. And yet the national census recorded a female participation rate in single figures. So these are the kinds of issues that economic historians face that also development economists face. And there are many others too. Let's take another example, the glaring failure to really come to grips with and understand unpaid work, and whether this be subsistence production in the family economy or on some small-scale agricultural units, or whether this also be housework, care work within the home. Not really taken on board by economic historians, and not taken on board also in very many national income accounts today. I know the UN has satellite accounts, I know all about this, but I still think that this is a sphere where we really need to push and do more work. And to give you an idea of the kinds of sources that I think we can pick up and use creatively, I have currently been, in the recent past, I've done a lot of work with life writing by working people. And here I speak from Britain, of course, and we are blessed by having a treasure trove of this kind of writing. So working class men often wrote about their lives, and not just men who made it in a conventional way. And there are also some writings, although much less frequently, they took place much less frequently by working class women. And this gives us insight into issues like distribution within the family, issues like how decisions were made, decisions about marriage, decisions about children, decisions about training, decisions about fertility, decisions about work, of course, and uncover a lot of issues and considerations that really demolish ideas of rational economic man and benevolent dictators within families. All the accoutrements of modern economics really come under pressure when we do this kind of work and we try and break open that black box of the family and look inside at family lives. So issues that come out, I'll just mention this and then I'll hand over to Samita to continue the discussion. But one other implication here is that these voices from the past can also tell us about things that we would completely overlook otherwise. For example, the women in my smaller set of working class autobiographies written by female authors very frequently talk about the dangers and pressures of sexual exploitation in the workplace. And yet in the over 600 working class men's autobiographies, this kind of issue came up twice. So here we find, a constant pressure on women's lives, a constant restriction on what they could do or be, as Amartya Sen, would want to say, a constant restriction on their capabilities and functionings. They were constrained by needing to not only take care they didn't fall into dangerous situations, but making sure that they weren't seen to do so. And another point that I want to make here is that women's lives were also affected, influenced, and wounded in many ways by their physical issues to do with being a woman. So periods, menstruation, completely overlooked really in most analyses, but really was a very significant constraint on what women could do and be. Today, we take it it's commonplace. We just go to the pharmacy, we buy sanitary products. These were actually not introduced as market commodities. We talk about demand creating supply. These were not introduced until after World War I, when many pharmacist companies had excess capacity in bandage production after the war. And so they thought, what can we use this capacity for? Oh, we'll make some sanitary products. Before that, women were trying to cope every month with rags, with leftover bits of cloth, which they then had to shamefully hide, behind the cupboard before they could actually cleanse this material. Here was another constraint then, a hidden constraint on women's lives historically. I'll leave it there for now. I do have loads more I could say. From my point of view, this Zoom call could go on for three days or something before I would kind of run out of points to make. But maybe Samita can join in now.
Thank you, Professor Humphries. These were very important points you made about how we actually look at the knowledge available to us through data archives and the things you mentioned about census. So the methods that we use for analysis need to be more carefully looked into. And I invite Professor Samita to make her remarks on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. And it is a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, my afternoon, different time zones for different people. And I should start by saying perhaps that, of course, many people in the audience will know this. I'm definitely not an economist. I'm not even an economic historian. If I had to describe myself as a particular kind of historian, I would probably say social historian or feminist historian. So where do I come in this discussion about economics and history? It is because the kind of social history I have done have required me to engage with economics a great deal. And I've kind of, in most of my work, taken a political economy approach. And that is kind of the way in which I've had to deal with and link with economic history and economists as well. And that is, of course, because my work is on labor and gender. I've had to look not only at production, but also at reproduction. And of course, reproduction means you're looking at sexuality and marriage, at wifehood and motherhood, which means you are necessarily having to deal, and I'm coming at it from kind of opposite direction of what Jane just said. So I have to deal with culture and ideology. You can't do gender without engaging with culture and ideology. But my problem was that when I was looking at these issues in the context of South Asia, it was dealt only as culture and ideology. And in a sense, it was like explanations were put in a black box of culture and not opened for scrutiny. This is perhaps because when I was doing my PhD, I was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I finished. This was the heyday of the cultural turn. And in South Asian historiography in particular, it was the dizzying rise of subaltern studies. And subaltern studies, so I was a master's student when the subaltern studies fourth conference happened in Calcutta, where Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak first joined the conference and then the movement. And this was what Shumit Sarkar has called the Saidian turn in subaltern studies. And part of the this turn in not only in subaltern studies in particular, but overall in South Asian history, meant an obsessive preoccupation with what we call now cultural nationalism, particularly the history of the colonial period, which is the primary sort of focus of subaltern studies. And this has dominated the historian's approach, and it has created an added complication. And that complication is that, in fact, a paradox that, in fact, subaltern studies, which began with the objective of looking at subaltern perspectives independent of elite mediation, or against the grain at least of elite mediation, ended up by being largely about the elite. So once we accepted that nationalism in the context of colonialism was itself subaltern, and women, of course, were subaltern, we did not push further to interrogate the relationship between elite women, say, and subaltern women. So this then became a bit of a problem. And my intervention was to broaden this understanding and try and bring the relationships of poor women into the framework. And to do that, I had to break out of the stranglehold of cultural explanations. And the only way I could interrogate this culturalist mode of a historical explanation was by taking a political economy approach. So that is why political economy became a very important means for me to ask questions about the subaltern of the subalterns, if you like, to frame it like that. And I see that to be my primary thrust of my research, and if anything, my primary contribution into historical scholarship of South Asia, that I actually look at the reproductive domains of poor and laboring women and try and factor that into our understanding of society, including colonial South Asia. And of course, I'm not saying here that we don't work with culture. You can't work without culture or an ideology if you're working with gender. But I think what one can do is to move beyond question, interrogate this implicit binary that often operates in our work between culture and economy, and not use one or the other as explanation for the other. So this is one way in which a conversation between economy and economics and history is very central to my work. The other way in which it is central is because I don't stick to doing history. Unfortunately, perhaps I should, but I don't. And I stray often into the contemporary, and that comes partly from the fact that I have been, as Shraddha said, very active in the women's movement, and my engagement in the movement has often required me to reflect on contemporary issues and respond to contemporary issues that have emerged in the movement. And I can't keep these two separate. So my two interests separate in separate domains. So I've tried often to connect my historical research and scholarship with these contemporary issues, which has meant that I've been a kind of self-taught, sometimes sociologist, sometimes anthropologist, I'm not sure what the disciplinary distinctions often are, and they blur in my work. So I follow a problem that I'm doing historical research on into contemporary political issues. And the one that has been very prominent in my own work is the question of marriage. This is, of course, it doesn't require much discussion to convey this, that marriage has a great centrality in South Asian societies. So in the census of 1901, the Census Commissioner made a comment which I find very striking, that India, at that time, undivided India, was the most married country in the world, is the comment he had made. And the data he had given was that 98% of women of an age above 10 and 92% of men above age 50, something like that, were married, were recorded as married in the census. So whatever the complications of this data may be, and of course, age data in South Asia is hugely problematic, but it is a fact that marriage was a very, very important social institution, and very large proportions of men and women were married, and married at a very young age. So that that social fact has not structured our understanding of South Asian society in the way that one would imagine would be important. It has neither been used as explanation or as a factor in understanding labor, or in understanding a wide range of social issues. At the same time, in the contemporary women's movement, despite and giving due importance to LGBTQ+ issues and the rising importance of these issues, a marriage has been very central to the women's movement, whether it is dowry murder, whether it is child marriage, domestic violence, in all kinds of campaigns, lobbying for legislation. Marriage has been a very, very central relationship. So marriage then has allowed me to connect my historical concerns with contemporary scholarly concerns, as well as my concerns in the women's movement. So in that sense, these kinds of lenses allow wider conversations, both between disciplines, among disciplines, as well as between scholarship and movements. Now, one last comment before I will hand over to Shraddha, hand back to Shraddha. And when I was sort of thinking about what I'll say today, I myself was a little puzzled about whether this is what kind of a relationship there is between these issues that I've laid out and my work on migration. And I think there is a bit of a chicken and egg problem here. So a lot of these issues that I've worked on has seemed to cohere around issues of migration. What I'm not sure about is whether in trying to understand migration, these fields have opened up, or whether in fact, many of these issues have ended up leading me to migration. But whatever that relationship may or may not be, Migration has seemed to me one of the, and here I will reflect a little bit on the points that Jane raised about sources. Migration is one of those historical events, processes, which often opens up the family to scrutiny. So for historians looking for sources, migration is often a very good place to go to look for sources about households, about families, the impact that migration has on households and families. So in that sense, the question of, and because migration is often the point of labor mobilization, it also allows for us to understand modes, processes of labor mobilization. But, so migration also has the other aspect, which is trafficking. And if you can bring migration and trafficking together, then another loop in terms of women's work gets closed. Because you then can connect these very different forms of work. Migration connects, for instance, factory work with sex work, with domestic work. And it allows you to, it has allowed me in my work to conceptualize the sort of recent, not so recent anymore, but the feminist engagement with women's work, and to broaden concepts of work. And once you embark on this broadening of women's work, we can see how frameworks can allow other kinds of questions. And one of the issues I think that is very important kind of frontier of women's work for us to understand is artificial reproductive technologies, what that means for women's work, the kind of very new frontiers of conceptual or very new conceptual challenges posed by this kind of these new kinds of reproductive work. So at the same time, if we look at continuums between, say, factory work and sex work, then we can challenge, question other binaries. For instance, the binary between formal and informal work, and see the connections between different forms of labor mobilization, particularly in the case of women. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Professor Samita. It was very important to look at how we should not be stuck in disciplinary boundaries and look beyond those and keep moving between history and contemporary research. Before we go forward and also ask our audience to make their comments, I would like to ask Professor Jane to respond to Professor Samita and make her remarks on what she said.
Yes, can I, let me just clarify what I meant about culture. I too really feel I need to challenge culture as a black box. That was the point I was trying to make in terms of persistence studies, that they present some kind of statistical correlation as a demonstration of cultural persistence, cultural grounding. And I think one value that feminists can find in historical work is to understand how culture is constructed and created and maintained by institutions and individuals seeking to shore up their own power position. So I think that historical work can help us to break open the black box of culture and see it as a product of often power relations, so that the things that we sometimes say are, oh, it's natural, turn out, to be adjuncts of a capitalist economy. I think the fixation of economists on self-interest, for example, is a product of thinking always within a capitalist framework. And if we look historically, we find evidence everywhere that, in fact, this kind of individualistic behavior is really not a universal. It's not a natural characteristic of the human race. So this is one thing that I think is of great value in doing historical work. Samita's comments about marriage, of course, really have great resonance with me too, because marriage is a very important aspect of trying to understand historical development, not least because demography plays a key role, the balance between population and resources, if you want, Malthusian constraints, play a key role in trying to understand when countries actually break out of the kinds of cycles we associate with Malthus and embark on modern economic growth. And here I think we can really find some lovely illustrations of the failure to really work on women, bring women into historical analysis, and you know, take this kind of analysis with women forward. So that there is a famous article by one gender historian who said, were women present at the beginning, at the demographic transition? So this is a case where a change in age of marriage and therefore, you know, a change in fertility, very crucial in understanding the big breaks in historical development. And it was analyzed completely without thinking through women's role in this. Women were not present in the demographic transition. The fertility was correlated with men's wages, and nobody, you know, thought to think, well, actually women are making the decision when to get married as well. So when Sarah Horrell and I have worked what Jacob Weisdorf and I put together painstakingly a series of historical wages for women, which, by the way, economic historians said could not be done, but it could be done. And then we looked at the response of marriage rates to women's wages. We found a very interesting phenomenon that when women's wages went up, they delayed marriage. they were Malthus's missing women. They delayed marriage, and that played a key role in the preventive check, in managing to keep population in line with resources. And that in turn played a very powerful role in securing Bose-European growth, if you want, in the British economy, which was the foundation eventually for modern economic growth. So we need to understand women's role in the economy, in the society, and in their families, not merely to understand women's lives, but to understand the way the whole economy develops, to understand, in fact, economic history and modern economics. So it's not simply working on women over here in this gender, in this ghetto of gender analyses. It's actually, we need women, because otherwise we'll be wrong as economic historians, we'll be wrong as economists.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Sen, please.
Yeah, I forgot to mention one thing, which Jane's comments reminded me, that I'm saying South Asia, but in fact, when you look at gender, one of the axes by which we talk of South Asia as multicultural, as diverse society, but one of the key diversities is gender. South Asia, in fact, is home to several gender regimes, not just one. So when we say South Asian patterns, there are some commonalities, but we should keep in mind actually looking at gender also draws your attention to diversities where we tend often to miss.
Thank you. We just take a pause to take some comments or questions from the floor. Anybody who is interested can raise their hands. Yes, Professor Agarwal, kindly unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful to, hi Jane, hi Samita. Nice to see you across continents. This is a great start of a discussion. So I want to mention three things. Firstly, starting from the question of culture and the way economists are today using culture is simply taking something called, some amorphous thing called social norms. So everything that can't be explained away becomes social norms. Now, that doesn't mean social norms aren't very important, but I've always insisted that we should actually then unpackage this black box of social norms. And within that black box, which I tried to do, when I was writing my book on property, Field of One's Own, is to distinguish, for instance, marriage patterns, distances of marriage, who you're allowed to marry, which brings out the diversity, in particular on South Asia, that you can marry, you can't marry in the same village, and you can't marry anybody in the village in North India, but you can marry across cousins and marry within South India. Now, unpackaging actually was very, very helpful in showing how, for instance, the close connection between a marriage norms and women's and the resistance that families have to giving women property, especially movable property like land. So if you're allowed to marry within the same village and in the family, as in South India or Sri Lanka, there was much less resistance than in North India, where there was huge resistance because you couldn't marry in the village and you had to marry at long distances. And families typically don't want to lose a major form of property like land. So I wanted to bring in back the close connection between social norms and economics, but the need to unpackage it. And here, what I found as a source, which was absolutely key, were ethnographies. So I looked at historical ethnographies from the late 19th century, up to the 50s, 60s, 70s, people were still doing ethnographies. I mean, anthropology changed after that. People no longer did village studies, but at that point in time, people were doing it. And I personally found them very, very useful, because what I could do was pick up from these hundreds of ethnographies I read. They would give details about how far you can actually get married, what are the distances, who you can marry, the social norm, and who you actually do marry, what proportion of marriages are within cross cousins. So I put all these in appendices, but these it's a pity that more people are no longer doing ethnographies within, including anthropologists. The second point I wanted to make was in relation, if you want to go back on property, now you talked about women's labor, but to try and assess women's, what were the debates around women's rights in property? I mean, especially in South Asia and India, you go back to the Dharma Shastras, which are 200 BC, but the translations of that were very useful. And sometimes we tend to forget how much debate there was within these, on these questions between different, it was only men who were debating among each other. But these debates were also interesting because they distinguish between sages who came from North India, who were much more conservative than sages who were in South India and who were talking. So these, but what I'm saying is these are nuggets, and it's, piecing together. I wanted to ask both of you as a question also on how, when you go far back, how do you actually piece together over decades what's been happening? And the third, very briefly, because Jane, you've worked quite a lot on environmental history, is that when I was working on my book on gender and green governance, and I wanted to see to what extent women were involved in any kind of governance at the village level. And the sources that I then used, so I found two things. Firstly, when I looked at feminist historians writing about gender, I found that they were not actually giving you evidence. What they were doing was they took women's position and inferred the impact of something, of changes, rather than saying, well, we've observed these changes. You simply inferred that if women are disadvantaged, of course, this is going to happen. But more particularly, so that was not very helpful. But what I found very helpful were colonial accounts. The castes and tribes of India, Samita, as you know, there were volumes and volumes of those, and again, historical ethnographies, which actually didn't talk about villagers and tribals and villagers fetched firewood, when it's very clear that it's women who fetch firewood. But the colonial accounts did mention things by gender. So if a woman went to fetch firewood, they would say it's a woman. Or if women were allowed in village councils, they would actually gender it. And I thought this was curiously interesting, that they were good at noting this down. Whereas later, in the, even in the 80s and 90s, when you see some of the feminist history, you find that people have just been conflated into villagers and tribals without any gendering of it. I don't know if this is also the case, Jane, when you look at environmental history in the UK, because you wrote that seminal paper on pre-enclosure, right? On this, which I always cite. So I thought sharing some of this from other perspectives on questions of property and questions of the commons might also be interesting in terms of what sources do you use. And thanks.
Thank you, Professor Agrawal, for making such nuanced observations. I'll invite both our speakers to respond to the comments and questions. First, Professor Sen, and then Professor Humphries.
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to say. I think these are comments and rather than questions. And I share with Bina the appreciation of much of many colonial sources, not only some of these ethnographies, but also state. So as a historian, I kind of, when I started doing my research, there was it was the time when historians began to be disillusioned with the archives. And there was a huge move to find new archives outside the formal state archive. And one of these was, of course, the vernacular, to find material in local languages. And I was very lucky that I was able to use both. I didn't have to choose. And I think the official colonial archives are a huge resource. And there is a lot of unexpected material. And following up Jane's previous comments, I think when one is writing women's history, one has to look in unusual places. If you are doing, if you're looking at a particular, I don't know, as an example, if you're looking at factory labor and you look only at factory records, then you may not find women or many of the interesting questions about women in factory records. You may have to look in child welfare records to find factory women as in child welfare records. So you have to look laterally, you have to look in unexpected ways, be adventurous and creative. And if you are adventurous and creative, I think official archives, state archives still has a great deal of information to yield to the interested searcher. So I think colonial records are very important for women's history, both ethnographies and state archives, but of course also vernacular material. I will not pose any hierarchical relationship between these different kinds of sources. I think all sources, women's historians are beggars who cannot be choosers.
Should I join in here?
Yeah, please.
Bina raises important points about always being conscious of property ownership as also a very powerful permissive factor or a constraining factor on women's lives, the legal framework around property ownership, and also local organization of access to resources is really very fundamental as well. So these are very important points. And I'd like to try and follow them up a little bit by coming back to Samita's points about needing to be courageous with respect to sources. So people probably are fully aware that when we talk about women's work, very often there's economists simply look at census data and look at female participation rates, which is to do really just with, in historically, the possession of an occupational title, or perhaps some wage employment. But of course, it doesn't capture women's work at all. And there's been a move within economic history that feminist economists may be very interested in, where women's work is identified by verbs, just by being recorded in historical sources, doing something. So that, for example, we can then start to use court records as really a very rich vein of sources to pick up on what women were doing and to then be able to categorize their activities. So this is women witnesses, women testifying in the courts, and they say, oh, I was getting water, or I was cleaning my master's window, or, you know, I was on my way to market, or whatever they were doing. And in this way, you can document women working, and you can document them working in particular sectors of the economy, and you can document them working also for their family or for another person. And in this way, you can put together, in more or less clever ways, you can kind of combine all this material to trying to find out what working days were like and what kinds of activities women did, which is completely different from simply finding out, is this woman described as a weaver? Is she described as a housewife? How is she described in the source? So that what this verb-led approach means is that we can start to try and break open another black box, and that is the black box of women's work historically. And these records can really take us all the way back to medieval times. But this also relates to the point that Samita said about trying to link up the vernacular with more mainstream sources. And I would say we can also try and link up these kinds of sources with more mainstream sources in economic history too. So that we can, for example, try and then relate our court records, you know, to what was actually said about women's working days. And in some work that I've just done with Raya Thomas, which we have actually published in the journal Feminist Economics, we spent a lot of time reading miners' wives' autobiographies and using them to construct a working day for a typical miner's wife. So it was an attempt really to try and use historical sources to construct an as-if time budget. So it's an as-if time recall questionnaire, a response to a time recall questionnaire. And when we've done this, we can then also look in more conventional sources, because several of these women who wrote their autobiographies also testified before the royal commissions, which were investigating conditions in pit villages. And we can investigate then what they said about their working day in the conventional sources and link the two kinds of information sets together. And I think this is also very rewarding. But I would echo what Samita said. I would say, if you want to work on women, you're not going to be satisfied with what the mainstream sources will tell you. You will need to be courageous and creative, and you will need to look elsewhere. I think posh cultural historians would say you have to read against the grain. I would say you have to read closely and you have to read at distance. And for me, that means you have to read stories about individuals, and you also have to gather data together in a way that it can be analyzed quantitatively. And we can find some bigger trends, some general trends. that we can locate our individuals within.
Thank you both so much for those additional comments and reactions. We have a number of questions piling up, and I just wanted to say this metaphor of the black box and digging deeper into the archives that are, more precious to us now than perhaps in the past leads to, contemporary thinking about the black box as containing these vast machine learning models and artificial intelligence that gives us outputs we're expected to understand or pay attention to or honor without understanding whether they're actually worthy or not. Elena had a question. Elena Nikolovna had a question about menopause. Elena, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. No, so I was just, thank you so much, by the way, for this very insightful discussion. I was just listening. So Jane mentioned periods. That was really interesting. So I was just wondering if there was work on menopause and how, because that's somehow related to periods historically, and how, whether throughout history we see any work on that. So that's all.
There has been a little bit of work trying to look at, for example, patterns of absenteeism of women in early factories, for instance. So to see if you could actually read into those patterns of absenteeism the disability occasioned by monthly periods. But nothing, I've not seen anything on menopause. The point I really wanted to underline with my example about the lack of response to women's need for sanitary protection until, there was this excess capacity in the pharmaceuticals firms, is that we understand, we hear all the time that capitalism responds to need, to demand. But here was a very chronic unmet need for centuries. And it was not responded to because, for one thing, it was embarrassingly culturally hidden away. It wasn't, and for another thing, I suppose, women couldn't back up their need with financial resources. So it was uninteresting to firms to respond to that demand until, as I say, they had this excess capacity created by the ending of World War I, the ending of the need to deploy a lot of bandaged material on the battlefront. So I think it's really a very interesting example of how capitalism doesn't respond to needs. It responds only to certain kinds of needs when they're manifest as wants and backed up with financial resources.
Professor Sen, did you have a comment to add to that?
No, because I don't think there has been historical work of this sort in the context of South Asia as yet. But just connecting to another question that's been posed in the chat about caste. A lot of issues of menstruation, of course, overlap with questions of caste. Because ritual norms that govern women's behavior during menstrual periods differ from caste to caste. That some anthropological work has been done. I particularly remember Karin Kapadea's very important work on Shiva and her sisters, an old book. But there hasn't been a lot lately. Do you want me to answer some of the other questions?
I was going to point towards Darshana Mini for her question. She's had her hand up for
Let her
some time.
ask her question then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, I can actually wait if you want to maybe address some of the other questions, because if those are connected.
Can I come in on the period and issue, menopause period?
Sure.
I just thought that I actually wanted to put it back to Smita that you know, there would be ethnographies, because during periods in South Asia, women couldn't cook, couldn't enter temples, and so on. So it's not so much about menopause, but the taboos around periods would be mentioned, and possibly there are colonial records as well, because they tended to be quite specific about when people were observing things. So I wondered, I mean, just pointing, I haven't done it myself, but there could be evidence there, possibly.
Can I just make a point here too, that bringing in Samita's point about how historical work has resonance with modern feminist activities, because the English football team just caused quite a stir by abandoning their white shorts and insisting on wearing dark blue shorts. And this caused quite a stir in the press, because of course they did this because they said they didn't want to wear white shorts when they were having their period, because it was very difficult to play football in white shorts when you were having a period. And the press was quite in quite a state over this, because they were kind of, oh, is this really an issue that we can bring up, you know, on our sports pages? So I think this is an issue of kind of embarrassment and shame. If men had periods, would they be treated in this way? Would they be something to be ashamed of, something to kind of not talk about, hide away? I think not. I think, in fact, it would be probably something that was taken as demanding special care and attention, and something that you know was institutionalized as requiring extra care and probably a disability payment or something. Maybe I'm being unfair.
I think Thuy Do had a comment on this as well. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was just saying that let's have the question from Darshana.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. So my question is regarding what Professor Samita has mentioned in terms of the kind of archive and the source material. So if we are thinking of projects where the idea of an institutional archive do not exist, and you're also curating your own archive in the process of connecting with the respondents, I was curious to know about the political economy approach, and also the feminist intervention, where you really constantly have to guard yourself from not outing the identities of your respondents. And I'm actually talking about the entertainment sector, and I'm working on gender parity and wage related questions, where many of my respondents want to participate, but they're also worried about their own kind of occupational results. Like if their current market rate is being outed, it will really impact their opportunities. So I'm curious to know about where does the ethics of the feminist ethnographer or feminist economic historian comes into play, and in your own kind of respective works, where there are instances where you actually thought like you really do not have data, you have to create data and an archive to work with because you have research questions, which begs that kind of approach. But again, the ethical questions about what do you leave them with? You do not want to leave your respondents hanging once you are in midst of your research. So any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Well, there are, of course, quite well-developed rules of anonymizing your respondents. And sometimes these can, sometimes these are quite difficult when you're the kind of people you are talking about. I guess if you gave any kind of information about them, if they're well-known celebrity kind of people, then it's easy for people to guess who they are if you try and hide their identity. So yeah, I mean, one will have to make the best effort. to anonymize respondents. But so there is a fine line between creating archives of contemporary research and creating archives of historical research. In historical research, it is much more difficult, and there is a question in the chat on folk songs, for instance, and that kind of material. And for historians, these are enormously helpful resources. But at the same time, they can be a double-edged thing because you can't date folk songs. So it is often, and nor do folk songs often have authorship. So you don't, for instance, now there's interest in two genres of folk song. There is the PhD level research being done. One is the Maharashtra grind mill songs, women's songs, which are very rich in information about perspectives about women's work. So there's been 2 or 3 scholars who are working on the Maharashtra, and I don't know if you know Pari. Pari is collecting these folk songs. So in fact, it's become accessible resource. And the other are the Bhojpuri folk songs, where there is a lot of material. It's very rich in migration material. And that is also being looked at. But one researcher has recently found, for instance, that a lot of the folk songs being sung in a woman's voice have actually been written by men. So these can be complex, and you have to be very, very vigilant in terms of how you collect, what you are collecting, what kind of research you do to contextualize historical sources that you collect. With contemporary, the kind of material you are talking about, which is interviews, which you do yourself, that is, of course, an absolutely, I mean, that is a very, very valuable way to access information that's not in the public domain.
I think that Thuy Do had a question. Let's go ahead and ask Bernardita.
Sure, thank you. I just wrote my question on the chat, and I was wondering the extent to which the number of practitioners, female practitioners doing research on feminist economics might in itself become a constraint. And I'm just speaking up out of my own experience. I don't know if this really may replicate in another developing countries or middle income countries, or even in developed countries. I really have no clue what the number of female economic historians are relative to economic historians in general. And I think that the kind of inquiry that feminist economics pose on the research, it's in itself a bit revolutionary. And therefore it replicates probably whatever the economic historian might be doing. And it would probably face like a wall with the colleagues, because you are looking at things differently. And therefore we might find resistance from our colleagues in our countries, but also elsewhere, because when the way we look at things are different, and they provoke some sort of incommodity. I don't know how you say, like you have to stop, like an itch, you know, like it provokes an itching in the mainstream. And I think it probably has a lot to do with or maybe I wonder, with the number of colleagues doing this. I
Can I respond? Should I?
Of course.
Yeah, Benedita, you have really hit a nail on the head here with a very large hammer, because of course, male economic, I mean, first of all, women are a minority in economic history, just as they are in economics. It's not easy to get the numbers there, though, because of course, economic historians, it's a fuzzy boundary with other disciplines. They're often in business schools, women economic historians. As Samita said, they may be, you know, in area studies or in development economics or in industrial relations, management. So it's not easy to get the numbers, but women economic historians are in a minority, and they are very much interested in questions which are heterodox from the mainstream point of view. They challenge that mainstream. My colleagues in Oxford, Steve Broadberry and his co-authors, just in the last couple of years produced a classic national accounts-based analysis of economic history, the economic history of Britain in the very long run, where they assumed that the female participation rate was 35 to 40% from 1260 right through to 1880 or something. So, and this was just an assumption that they made based on census data for the mid-19th century. And my friend and colleague Carmen Sarasua gave a seminar in Oxford where she used her own work on Spain to show that, in fact, female participation rates were chronically underrepresented in the census. And she then not merely used that material to revise the female participation rate, but to draw implications then for structural change of the Spanish economy, which of course, because women work in different sectors, so our vision of structural change is completely wrong if we do not take account of women's work in a proper way. And of course, there's also massive implications for productivity if we fail to count the labor force in a sensible fashion. And I have to say that our male colleagues were aghast, and they, you know, took up arms against this particular perspective. They were they were not thrilled to have to try and think through how they were going to integrate women's work and female workers into their story of long-run economic development based on national income accounts, which didn't have any recognition for most women workers. And I'm sure that Carmen's found similar responses when she's presented this work in Spain. So Benedita, you're quite right that this is not, very often our projects are not welcomed by our male colleagues, or our male colleagues who are actually defending the mainstream. They may not actually be men. They may simply be people who, you know, have got heavily invested in these particular methodologies and this particular way of constructing economic development in the long run. So I think this is really a very serious issue. It's the same with women's unpaid work, for instance. Nobody really wants to consider that because represents a series of challenges to mainstream national income accounting approaches. That threatens a lot of work that has been done. On the other hand, some of you may well know that the new growth theory brings in human capital formation as a key way of bridging Malthusian stagnation and modern economic growth. There's a transition that's associated with human capital formation. And this increase in human capital formation is related to changes in women's status in the long run, often associated with demographic change. So women have come into economic history, but it's kind of through the back door of a theory wanting them to play a role here. So suddenly some mainstream economic historians have got interested in women, but it's only because theory has demanded that they play this particular role in the new growth theory, in long run, in the theoretical framing of long run economic development. And I find that really quite ironic and quite interesting. But just as feministic economics in general represents a challenge to the mainstream, feminist economic history is also a serious challenge to the mainstream. And therefore, it's often a very uncomfortable practice, to be entirely frank.
Twee Do has been waiting, and then Bina Agarwal has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Many things you talk is related a lot to my research. So I'm thank you for all the information. So my question is for Dr. Humphries. I brought a question here, but I can read it. Like you mentioned about the data, the resources is overlooked women. So how? And then you, in the past, so I can see it. I can the records and the records of the resources on women is like missing a lot. So how we deal with that? And when we say that we need to look at the past, and the past we don't see anything about women. And if we go, I am a feminist study, so I usually interview women, and the senior already passed away. So I can still interview some, but it's challenges sometimes. And like the number of participants I interview is limited. And you also talk about the period product, because in my interview with the senior women, they also mentioned about this stuff, and they use something that not what we are using now, and it was distributed by the government. So how what we suggestion about that issue, like what we can say about that. And for Dr. Sen, you mentioned about the elite women, the relationship between elite women and like ordinary women or the Spartan women. And so how to break through the contents, like your suggestion, like how like how you do it, like how, what is your suggestion on that, and how we can engage culture to learn about that? Because to me, like culture is big, like many things. So what kinds of culture? So this question can be true for both of you. Like you not talk a lot about culture. So what kind of culture and what the kind of data resources? You also mentioned about folk song or something, but I want you to talk more about that. Like to me, culture is many things. And what is the resources? What are the resources about culture that you think is good to talk about these things, like the focus? Thank you.
Perhaps we can go ahead and get the last couple of questions out there as well, and then we'll ask, we're in our last 10 minutes, so we'll ask each of our speakers to address whichever of them they can, and also give us a concluding remark. So Bina, would you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. This was really about counting economic historians. So, you know, how would you place people like me and others who use contemporary analysis, but also have always end up doing historical research? Would you count us as 1/3, a quarter, or somewhere along the way? Because I always find, and do you feel that in terms of when you're teaching students, even when they're doing economists doing standard econometric work, to encourage them to look at history in terms of process, as you said, Jane? And a related question was, you know, this book that you've just juried, where you have women who are doing economic analysis but are not counted as economists in history. So how would you would you share something of that?
And I'll go ahead and ask Paro and Nidhi to add your questions to that. Very, very rich question already.
Hi, thank you, Joan. My question is, you know, to all the fabulous feminists out here. I'm really frustrated with the discussions around social norms and this obsessive focus on changing people's minds. Let's, do some education programs, let's do some information programs and get people to behave in gender egalitarian forms. And so there's a complete disinterest in locating norms at, as something that are structural and understanding the limitations of what is, using behavior as proxy for social norms. So my question was, what kind of methodologies can we use to push back? What kind of methodologies have worked for you to sort of place the argument on social norms in its right place? Thank you.
Thank you. And Needy, will you ask your question as well? And that will be the last one we can get to. Needy, are you still here? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and
then Juan, if Nidhi is not here, can we take Shri Manjri's question?
Yes, please, Shri Manjri.
Yeah. Shri Manjri, can you please unmute yourself and ask?
Hello, thank you for the discussion. So I just wanted to ask Dr. Sen that I'm currently looking into women's network and their workforce participation in Kolkata. So I plan to do a field work. So I just wanted to understand how through the history of Kolkata and women's workforce participation, I can look into their networks. So, thank you.
Thank you for those questions. And we'll start this time with Professor Sen and then ask Professor Humphries to add her responses and final thoughts as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, since we have been invited to be autobiographical in this panel today, to respond to Bernadette's question. When I began to do my PhD and I wanted to work on women in factory, my supervisor in Oxford, Jane, told me that this can't be done. It's an undoable PhD. When you do labor, you can't do women. So if you want to do women, you have to do professional women. So he asked me to choose a particular lawyer and do my PhD on that. And of course, the more opposition at that age you face, the more determined you get to, obstinate, basically, you get to do what you wanted to do. So I pursued, and then I had to shift from Oxford to Cambridge to do my PhD. So yes, there was enormous resistance to the kind of work we were trying to do in the 80s and early 90s. But in the South Asian context, there has been so much absolutely wonderful work on gender in the history, in the discipline of history, that actually now history is gender is one of the happening things in history. And a lot of men historians want to now join the bandwagon. So in a sense, the situation is very different. The past sort of 20, 25 years, women's history has moved forward, but that doesn't mean there still aren't areas of enormous resistance. And economic history perhaps remains one of the areas where the resistance is highest. Yeah, to Do's question about subaltern elite and questions of culture. So what I was trying to, of course, I fully agree with you that culture is a very big thing. And it is because it's a big thing that to answer questions by saying it's culture is often not very helpful. So say if I ask a question like why unlike say cotton textile industry, early cotton textile industry almost everywhere in the world had very high proportions of women and children. In here, of course, but in China, Japan, even in many Asian countries, early cotton textile industry had very high proportion of women. In South Asia, there isn't. In South Asia, it's still in cotton textile industry, as indeed in most industries, women are a very small proportion of the workforce. Now, if you are, the explanation for a long time was that this is culture. because of culture, women don't work. It is South Asian culture that women don't work. Therefore, they are not in any kind of work. Therefore, they are also not in the factory. So that is the kind of question you can pose to culture, and to open it up, to say, what exactly is this culture that women don't work? And so that is by asking, so it's the question you ask is what I'm trying to say. And not to be satisfied with this generalized answer about culture. That helps to unpack many of these, domains about women's work, which usually don't get scrutinized in social sciences. What was the question about women's networks and women's work in Kolkata? It depends a little bit on the period that you're looking at. And I see that you're saying contemporary Kolkata. Now, if it is in contemporary Kolkata, there is a range of kinds of work that women do. If you're looking at poor women's work, for instance, so one of the statistics I quote very often is that a quarter in the 2011 census, a quarter of West Bengal's female workforce is engaged in paid domestic work, which is an incredible statistic. So yeah, I mean, there are many ways in which you can look at that question. So it depends a little on what kind of work you want to look at. And maybe we can, correspond. I need a lot more information to be able to help you with this. So we can correspond about this later.
Thank you so much. And Professor Humphries.
Yes, first a quick response to Bina. As usual, she's asked a very important, well, she's made a very important point here, which is it's very, very difficult to classify people as economic historians when they very often, as Samita's pointed out, their work moves forward also into current issues. And I think you would be a very strange historian if you weren't really interested. I mean, I have a colleague in Oxford who says history is about the present, and I think that's I mean it's a bit of a soundbite, but I think there's some truth to that. And Bina also raises another wonderful point, which is that there are very many writers in the past who were economists. They were writing about women's economic lives. They were writing about the broader economy. But their work was viewed as literary or advice books or, some kind of conventional commentary. And the Iafis Agarwal Book Prize, which has just been awarded, and I was very fortunate to be on the jury, so I got to read lots of absolutely excellent books. But it's gone to Joanna Rosteg for her book, which is a history of economic thought, which recovers several women writers who were clearly economists and writing as economists, but have been dismissed in these ways. Their work has been, lost to us. And Joanna has uncovered this work and brings it to our attention. And one of these writers, of course, is Jane Austen. And this is an account, not the kind of famous account of the exchange between the brother and his wife in the carriage as they leave poor Eleanor and Marianne's house. This is a rather a less central. She picks up on less central figures in Sense and Sensibility, and she shows how these women are really reflectors of the economic context in which they're operating. And it's an absolutely fabulous read. So I do urge people to follow up on that. Even if you're not interested in the history of economic thought, this is something that goes beyond the normal conventional lines there. But I did want to finish really with reflecting on I'm probably going to say your name completely wrong, but Thoido's comment, which is really again about sources. If mainstream sources really don't dig deep enough and pay enough attention to the nature of women's work, they're not interested in women's family lives, they miss out on issues to do with demography, and they shy away from anything to do with women's physical activities, physiology of the female body. How can we actually get at these issues? And here I think, we just have to come back to what Samita and I have both banged away about, which is you have to work hard. You have to look at sources with a critical eye, and you have to dig deep. Let me end perhaps with one example. And this is, I'm always interested in how women were involved in cleaning away, the debris of life. And this is a key part of social and physical reproduction in the past. Women really, they emptied the privies, they cleaned up the slop buckets. This was women's work. But you can find very little reference to this in archival sources. But I was reading a source for a completely different project, which was to do with a hospital during the Civil War. And I was reading, I'm rather, I spend a lot of time reading rather dull account books. I should warn you, this is the meat and drink of economic historians, is to read these dull account books. But this was a dull account book for a hospital during the British Civil War, the English Civil War. And they were listing what they paid the nurses, which was what I was interested in. But then I came to a regular payment to Goody somebody or other, I forget her last name. And she was paid a very small amount of money to empty twice a day all the commodes in the ward where the men were incapable of moving. So this woman was really paid to empty all these commodes, and and I could record her pay, and I can say this was the pay, the standard market rate for cleaning out, well, essentially shoveling shit, frankly, in this institution, for this period of time. And I often think of old Goody, there she was doing this work day in, day out. And I just stumbled across this labor in the account book. And it's very important. It's a really important record. So that
it looks like you are muted. And I'd like to say thanks to Shraddha Jane for organizing this wonderful panel. And Shraddha.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to all of you, to our speakers and all the participants for engaging in such important discussion. I'm sorry for vanishing in between because of my bad throat, and grateful to John for taking over instantly. And I thank IFE admin Jihi Jolly Mombi for having this, facilitating this discussion, and mostly Joanne for making this happen today. I hope we keep engaging in such discussions, and our engagement does not end with this discussion, and we would like to connect to our speakers for future events. And many thanks for Professor Agarwal for making such important interventions. Keep looking at IFE, IFE social media handles website for new events. Thank you. Joanne, you want to add something?
The IAFE conference is coming up, and you can find information about that at the website, iafe.org. And we hope to see you there and to see you online at our further events. Thank you, everyone.
Special thanks to our speakers. Thank you.